Saint-Domingue, 1802. Napoleon had anticipated victory in a matter of months. He was wrong.
The war in Haiti is the first example of guerrilla warfare in the history of modern warfare. For Haitians, it was the Armageddon. They had nothing to lose by going all out. Losing the war was losing their liberty, and they put their liberty above everything else. And the French at that time had never experienced anything quite like that. It was enormously bloody. The Haitian Revolution was, until that time, the most bloody war there was.
The rebels of Saint-Domingue dragged the war on. 2 months into the campaign, as the rains set in, they stall the French, for the guerrillas have a secret weapon in this war. Napoleon's troops are vulnerable to yellow fever, unlike most locals who have developed immunity to the disease. The treatments available are few: elixirs of wine and bark, or bleeding the patient.
The soldiers just died like flies.
In September of 1802, General Leclerc reports to Napoleon that of almost 30,000 men, only 4,000 are still able to fight. 2 months later, Leclerc dies as well. Meanwhile, Napoleon has rallied 20,000 fresh troops to invade New Orleans. Instead, he has to send most of them to Saint-Domingue as reinforcements. 3,000 remain at a port in Holland, still braced to take Louisiana. But a last fluke event seals the mission's fate.
Ice storms, and the ships were literally trapped in the harbor by ice. It would have been interesting to think of what might have happened had the ships been able to embark, had they actually gone to Louisiana.
Napoleon is barred from invading Louisiana not by American will or diplomatic finesse, but by ice, the mosquito, and an island rebellion that defied prediction.
Napoleon had the option of accepting Toussaint Louverture as his governor general, and he could have supported Toussaint in this, the restoration of the French Empire in the Americas. But the Haitian Revolution demonstrates the arrogance of power. It shows that one should not underestimate people of whom we know very little. Haiti was the second independent state in the Western Hemisphere. Haiti was a watershed for Napoleon. It was the beginning of the end because these were the best trained and the most skillful of French troops, the flower of the French military, and they did not come home upright.
The world is closing in on Jefferson as well. His detractors are demanding that American forces capture New Orleans before French troops get there. Across the Western Territories, frontiersmen muster with drills to ready for the seemingly inevitable assault. One wrote this letter to the Kentucky Gazette: 700,000 persons will not wait for Mr. Jefferson. They are almost in a state of revolt. 3,000 Kentucky militia could put the U.S. in possession of the fairest country in the universe. Good God, can all Western America be dead to their true interests? February 1803. Congress passes a resolution directing the president to raise a militia of 80,000 men to invade New Orleans and seize it from the Spanish. Jefferson instead digs in and holds out for his last chance at diplomacy. France's high officials get word that Napoleon has come to a realization. Renewed war with England is imminent, and France needs funds badly. With Saint-Domingue a lost cause, the Louisiana Territory is as well.
And the decision is to offer the Americans not simply the port of New Orleans, but the entire Louisiana Territory, everything from New Orleans up the Mississippi to present-day Canada and then over to the Rockies.
all of these little contingent events that pressured Napoleon into making an offer that was much more than Jefferson was asking for.
Hours before Monroe arrives, Livingston is told the news. His startled response? The United States has no interest in all Louisiana, only New Orleans. But he gives it some thought, and the next day, during a party to honor Monroe, he catches sight of Napoleon's Minister of Finance pacing nervously outside. François de Barbé-Marbois urges him to meet later. It is late at night, in a hushed conversation between Livingston and Barbé-Marbois, that the Louisiana Purchase comes to be.
It's a cataclysmically historic event. It's a major breakthrough. I mean, here's two guys in the middle of the night determining the fate of 40% of what's now the United States, in this huge tract of land that's going to open the way to American expansion, that's going to completely close down all of the French dreams of reestablishing an American empire.
Napoleon has authorized a selling price of less than $10 million, but Barbé-Marbois shrewdly begins the negotiation at more than double that amount. In the weeks ahead, a sum is at last agreed upon: $15 million.
December 20th, 1803, a milestone of a ceremony in what we now call Jackson Square. The colonial era flags are lowered, the American flag is raised.
The Creoles were not particularly happy with the idea of becoming American. There are recollections of Jackson Square as the flags were being exchanged, Americans cheering and the French standing glumly in the background.
Pierre-Clément Laussat transferred the French colony of Louisiana to the American commissioners, James Wilkinson and William Claiborne. And so on that date, Louisiana became a territory of the United States.
President Jefferson tries to get the Marquis de Lafayette to agree to come and be the governor of Orleans Territory. He tries to get James Monroe. William Claiborne is the governor of neighboring Mississippi Territory, and he has been for a couple of years.
And when he arrived, he didn't really get along well with the population. He didn't understand the language or the customs, and he managed to ruffle the feathers of a lot of the locals who could have helped him out.
He was frequently quoted as saying, "Louisiana is incapable of governing itself."
Anglo-Americans are coming down, they speak a different language, they have different religions, they have different concepts of law, and so we start to see the laying of the groundwork of this Creole-Anglo rivalry that dominates New Orleans culture and politics.
So there's a lot of political instability, a lot of distrust of the locals toward the Americans, especially toward Governor Claiborne. The cultural challenge, if you will, of taking over New Orleans and Louisiana in general is one of the most complex aspects of the historical situation.
About 10,000 people lived in New Orleans at that time. And it did begin growing after the Louisiana Purchase, but it grew most dramatically beginning in 1809.
Refugees start to come out of Saint-Domingue in the tumult of the early days of Haitian independence, and around 9,000 arrive in the year 1809.
Most of these were French-speaking peoples. A lot of them were free people of color. And of course, the nearest French-speaking city of note was New Orleans. So a number of refugees flocked to the city, more than doubling the size in a short time.
The influence of the Saint-Domingue refugees has had a profound influence on the development of what we identify as Louisiana culture.
Many of these were very skilled artisans, many of them classically educated. They brought a lot of culture and traditions to Louisiana and New Orleans.
They really established much of the cultural advancement of the city. They were amongst the first to establish newspapers in this area, to establish education. The Saint-Domingue refugees, blacks, whites, free and slave, brought with them the French language and French traditions of Saint-Domingue and brought that into New Orleans, a city that was already beginning to more Americanize after the Louisiana Purchase, which suddenly re-Francified rather quickly.
It's amazing in that this period you have so many diverse groups. You have a burgeoning commerce, you have a burgeoning population. As a great port city, you are getting people from all over the Maritime. visitors remarked that you could hear the languages of all nations of the world.
The accommodation to new residents of all types was fueling this physical growth of the city as former plantation lands began to be subdivided into city squares and building lots.
You have the creation of faubourgs beyond what had been the old city limits, the Vieux Carré, which pretty much stopped at Canal Street on the upriver side and Esplanade Avenue on the downriver side.
Immediately from the time that Claiborne and Wilkinson come in to receive the territory, it's a period of great turmoil.
Claiborne's project was, okay, how do we get this established society to be integrated into the United States?
There is some sense on the part of Americans that Louisiana needs some time to become more American, to be less European, to be more orderly, to grasp the legal system of the United States, which of course they don't really do because they keep the code law in lieu of going to English common law, which is what the rest of the United States operates under.
The native Creole population, which once, of course, ran the city in every way, economically, politically, culturally, sees these incoming groups with increasing levels of threat.
America is in this situation where they have, for all intents and purposes, colonized an area. You have structures of government already in place. You have cultural differences and racial differences.
There was certainly tension between the original population, the Creole population, if you will, and the new Americans. Jefferson began targeting specific members of the population who he thought might not necessarily be so loyal to the United States and throwing them in jail.
Almost immediately after the United States took over the territory, there was a group of French went to Congress petitioning for statehood immediately. As long as they were part of the United States, they wanted statehood and the rights to set up government here. And they continued to petition. And finally, in 1811, a time in which the population of the area more than doubled, so they more than met the requirements for population to become a state.
And on April 30th, 1812, Louisiana entered the Union as the 18th state.
And by the time of statehood, Claiborne managed to win the election as the first governor of the state over native Jacques Villeray.
Louisiana entered the Union just literally on the eve of war with Great Britain, and of course the final and some might say decisive battles of the 1812 conflict was fought very close to the city of New Orleans.
The Battle of New Orleans certainly helped create a sense that Louisiana was part of the United States and the people were citizens of the United States.
The Battle of New Orleans, if it did anything, sort of settled the question of the ownership of Louisiana. After Jackson's successful defense of New Orleans, European powers no longer really contest American ownership.